Hi guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to this another video tutorial on creating an ASP.NET Core 2.2 Web API application with Angular 7. And in this video tutorial, we will be creating our login method. And the login method, we will use JWT Authentication. Now, what do I mean by JWT authentication? JWT means JSON Web Token. So every time a user logs in the application, he will receive a token and he will use that token every time when he's making a request to prove that he is a valid user. In this video tutorial, I will show you the process how you can implement JSON Web Tokens authentication in your ASP.NET Core 2.2 Web API. If you are using ASP.NET Core 2.1, this method should work fine as well. So what is this JWT? The JWT standard provides a compact and a self-contained way where we can transfer information between both the parties, that is our backend and our frontend, that's our client and the server, using JSON object. So this JWT token will be containing a signature that is unique to our application, and using that signature, and it will also contain a key, a secret key that we will use, and using that signature and secret key, ASP.NET Core will validate if the token is valid. Let's have a look at this diagram to understand JWT token-based authentication. So as you see here, that there is a client and there is a server. Client is basically the browser or the user that is making the request to our server. So let's say the client wants to access the products in your application. He wants to see a list of products, but you have limited this view only to registered users. So that means when somebody is trying to access the products list, the application should check if the client that is trying to access that product view is registered with your application. If the client is registered, then they should possibly be able to log in. Once they are logged in, they will receive a token from the server. This is the JSON Web Token. Then they will attach that token to the request to view the products. Once the server receives that request, it will verify if that token is valid. As every token has a signature that contains the secret key and also the expiry time when it's going to expire. So if this token is valid, after all the validation parameters have been met, required criteria has been met, the server decides if it is valid, then it will send a 200 OK response saying that the client is valid and he will be able to view the products view. Now, since we want to send this token to our client when they log in, we should implement a middleware. To start implementing the bearer-based authentication, we should implement and we need to implement a middleware in ASP.NET Core. And we have to implement it in our startup class. We have to configure it to use JWT Bearer authentication. So let's go ahead and configure the JWT Bearer authentication scheme in our services. So to add our authentication middleware, we will call our services object and then call the AddAuthentication method, and then within this authentication method we are going to specify the parameters that need to be validated when authenticating a user. Since we are using JWT based token bearer based authentication, we are going to add that to this middleware. So we will say add JWT bearer, and within this We will specify the options for validating our bearer token, and within the add authentication we will specify our authentication scheme, which is JWT token-based authentication. So now to configure the options, first thing that we need to do is we need to have the options to validate a token provided inside the appSettings.json file. So how do we validate a token? How do we make sure that this token was issued by this website? How do we validate it? So we validate it by the secret key inside the token, the signature, the issuer, the sign-in key. These are all these options that we will use to validate the token, to make sure that the token was created and sent by an valid source, that is our website. So now we will first go ahead and create those options here in our appSettings.json file. Also, we will use an hard-coded class. We will directly not access this options. We will create a hard-coded class for the options, and using that class we will access the appSettings.json file. Since it is recommended by Microsoft that since the launch of ASP.NET Core 2.2, it was recommended by Microsoft, in order to access the values in appSettings.json file, we make use of hard-coded classes. So let's go ahead and create a class for accessing the options from our appSettings.json. So what we want to do is we will create a new folder in our project, and we will name this folder as helpers, and all the required classes that help us to perform some kind of actions in our application, we can create them under this folder called as helpers. Since we are going to need a hard-coded class to access these values from appSettings.json file to sign our token, we are going to call this class as appSettings. So let's call this, I'm just going to change this to an empty class and then call this appSettings. So that's it, and I'm going to create this new class. Now the next thing that I want to do is create some properties. So I'll get rid of these constructors since I don't need the constructor, and now I'll add the properties. So go ahead, pause the video and add these properties. So we will need 4 properties that we would use to sign our JWT token. One is the site, the audience, the expiry time, and the secret. The secret is basically the secret key of our token. The expiry time, when the token is going to expire. We will validate if the token is already expired, then we will redirect the user to the login page to log in again so they get a new token. If the audience that has requested that particular in that token is valid, so let's say the audience is our website, which is techhowdy.com, and also the site, which is techhowdy.com. They usually are the same. So now save this, and now we would be able to assign the values of these appSettings.json file to this hard-coded file that we just created, this class. So to do that, let's go back to our appSettings.json file and let's create the options here. So here I'm going to add a section, call this as app settings. So the naming convention is the same. The name of my class is app settings. So I have used the same name for the section as well. And within this section, I will have the options. We will use the same names that we used for the properties. So let's go ahead and create these options. So pause the video and go ahead and create these options. So I have created an option for site, secret, expire time, and audience. And as you see here, the naming convention, it's the same as it's in my class. Also make sure that you provide your site name, your secret key, your expire time, and your audience, who's going to be your audience in these values. So you can add anything as your secret key. So you can add some alphanumeric string over here, or you can add just numbers, it's up to you. Or you can create one random string and add it here. But every time the token is generated, it will contain this secret and the site and the expire time and the audience. And this time here 60 would be in minutes, so a token will expire every hour, so it's only valid for 1 hour. So go ahead and save this file, save our appSettings.cs, go back to our startup class, and now we will make use of the values, the options, when we are creating our JWT Bearer service. Here inside the AddAuthentication method, we will set the default authentication scheme to JWT Bearer default authentication. So let's go ahead and do that. So I have added the default authentication scheme to be JWT Bearer authentication, and the default sign-in scheme as well to JWT Bearer default authentication, and the default challenge scheme as well to JWT Bearer default authentication scheme. Now the next thing that I want to do is go ahead and add the missing references. So let's go ahead and add using Microsoft.asp.NET Core.authentication.jwtbearer. By doing this, the errors will not appear anymore. The next thing that we want to do is inside the AddJwtBearer method, we will specify the JWT bearer options where the issuer sign-in key, the valid issuer, and the valid audience are assigned from the values sourced in the appSettings.json file. So let's go ahead and add those options inside the AddJWTBearer method. So we will say we are going to use JWT Bearer defaults dot authentication scheme, and then we are going to set some options to validate our JWT token. So these options can be specified here inside this method, and let's go ahead and specify those options. So we'll say options dot token validation parameters, because we are going to validate the token to make sure the token is valid. So new token validation parameters. So what happened here? I made a mistake. Go to new token validation parameters. Did I spell it wrong? Oh yeah, I put two T's there. Parameters. Oh, I just want to make sure that, yeah, I have this, and now inside this I'm going to add my options. So first we want to do is go ahead and add these missing reference to identity model tokens, and then we will pass the options. So valid issuer sign-in key, valid issuer sign-in key is equal to true. So our token, we are basically saying that our token is going to have a valid issuer sign-in key. So that's the reason why we have set it to true, and the issuer sign-in key is provided in the appSettings.json file. Now, the next thing that we also want to set to true is to validate the issuer in the token. So ASP.NET Core is going to validate the issuer. So validate issuer. So who issued the token, it's going to validate it. The next thing that we are going to set is to validate the audience. So validate the audience, and it's equal to true as well. Now what we want to do is we need to set these three options to valid, and we want to tell from where you're going to get these values. So we will say these values, as we know, are going to come from our appSettings.json file. But in our startup class, we have not yet configured a method or an object that will go and get these options. I mean, these options are, I told you that we are using this hard-coded class over here to get the values from our appSettings.json file. But in the startup class, how do we use it? So to do that, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and configure our strongly typed objects. And to do that, we will create an variable that will hold these objects. So we'll call this as app settings section. So what this variable will do, it will get the values of all the options from the app settings section. So let's go back to startup, and then using the configuration object in our startup class, if you're wondering where the configuration object, it's already been initialized here. So we are going to use that configuration object, and then dot, there is a method called as get section, which helps us to get the section from our appSettings.json file. But when we need to get a specific section, we need to specify the name of that section. So the name of our section is app settings. So don't make a mistake here, just copy and paste it over here, and that should be it. Next thing that we want to do is go ahead and create a service that will configure these options for us. So services dot configure, and what we want to configure is the app settings. So our app settings class, so the one which we created under helpers, so it will map over all the values to the properties of this app settings class using the configure method. And now we have to specify which values you want to map over. It's coming from this object, so we'll do this over here. Now we have configured all the values from our app settings.json file in the app settings section to these properties in the app setting.cs class. Now what it will do here is all the properties like site will be mapped over to site, audience will be mapped over to audience, secret will be mapped over to secret, and so on. But let's say if there is any other value in your app settings.json file, let's say there is, just giving you an example, there is another value here saying ABC and is equal to something, and when it tries to map over ABC into this property in your app settings.cs, it will not find any property called as ABC, whatever it is. So it will just ignore it. If there is no property with that name, it will just ignore it. So you can delete this now. We don't need this. Just to make you aware about that if there is no property to map over with the same name, it will just ignore it. So a service has been configured for getting these values from our app settings class, And now what we need to do is we need a variable that will hold the values. It will go and get the values from this app settings class. So to do that, we will create a variable and call it app settings, and is it equal to app settings section, and then we will call the get method, and here we need to specify get which class values. So I'm going to say app settings, and now these app setting variable will hold all the values like the sign in key, your secret, and so on. So now one thing one more thing that we need to do is we need to encode our secret key. That's because we don't want others to know what is our secret key, so we will encode it. So encoding, we use encoding. Let's add the missing reference. So encoding is available under using system.text, and then you will use the format to encode. And now we will specify what we want to encode. So it's app settings. This app settings dot the secret. So guys, as I mentioned earlier, try to have a something secure over here like a string. Some people use some lengthy string over here which is like alphanumeric. So for this project, which is very simple, it's fine, but for in real time, people don't use such kind of secret keys when they sign their tokens. So now let's going back to our startup class. Now we have the values, we can access them. So now we will provide the values, and the token validator will validate the values from received from the app settings variable against the values that is sent by the client that is trying to access some resource on our website. So we will say valid for valid issuer, use the app settings dot site property. Then for so again this should be comma for valid audience is equal to app settings dot audience. And finally for issuer sign in key, we are going to use the issuer sign in key. As we know, our key is encoded, so we need to use the symmetric security key class, and then read the key. So we will then read the key, and we will verify that if the key matches the app settings.json key that we specified here. So now let's go ahead and save our startup class. That should be it for our services for adding authentication. One last thing that we want to do is, since we are using authentication, we need to mention in our configure class that we are going to use authentication in our app. So to do that, what we want to do is go ahead and say app.use authentication, and make sure that you call this method before your app.use MVC or app.add MVC. It is very important that you make sure that you call this method before app.use MVC. And the reason to do that is we want to handle authentication early in the pipeline. So that's the reason why we will put it in before the use MVC. So as we know, everything inside the configure method will go in a sequence, will execute in a sequence. So first we want to execute the authentication service and then the app.useMVC. And I'm getting an error here because I have used a semicolon. So let's remove this semicolon. Now we can save this file and we can go ahead and build our project to make sure that there is no errors. And also in the next video tutorial, we will go ahead and continue coding this login method in our application, where we will make use of this JWT token that we are going to create using the service, and that we are going to validate using the service, and we are going to create a method in our login which will help us to create the token when the user logs in. So now for this video tutorial, it's it. So now please continue watching the next video tutorial, because that will be a continuation of this video tutorial. So thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Tech Howdy.